Government has outlined regulations under level 1 lockdown. For a discussion on this, I'm joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu and Dr. Sam Koma of HOD for research at Milpark Business School. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Now, Sanusha, perhaps let me start with you, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spotlight. But what's your reaction on the latest commitment by SAA to rescue, by government to rescue SAA by a tune of 10.5 billion rand?
Good afternoon, Unathi. I think it's another attempt to try and salvage something that is not salvageable. The amount of money that the government is going to be spending in bailouts, or have spent on bailouts with this SOE, with the state airline, and the amount of money that they want to spend on the state airline, I think is ludicrous and ridiculous in terms of the fact that we don't have the kind of luxury to spend this type of money when we have serious dire constraints, when the economy is not at where it should be, where we know that we are contracting radically in terms of our economic GDP numbers. The annualized growth that came out for the last 2 quarters, about 51% contraction. And if you're going to basically, if the airline industry across the world is in a crisis because of COVID, and SAA was in a crisis before COVID, I'm not sure why we still want to rescue this airline. And I think the problem here is that there are too many unknowns that are not being put forward in terms of information that needs to be put out in the public domain about what is behind the door issues with regard to this airline that precedes this COVID, that started before COVID-19, and why this airline has to continuously be bailed out. I think at this point in time, to keep trying to find money into something that's not, is sinking and has probably already become a Titanic, is ridiculous.
Dr. Koma, perhaps let me put you under the same spotlight and ask you the same question about SAA. Do you think that government is handling this matter well?
Not at all. The airline, at some point, when it was placed under business rescue, we were promised that there would be drastic radical measures put in place to save one job and also to get the airline back on track in terms of being commercially viable and also to be able to begin to break even and also to make a profit. But it appears that since the business rescue practitioners were appointed, they've been frustrated by the shareholder, which is government, in terms of controlling the airline by putting the funds in place, which is, as they estimated then, was around 5 billion rand. Now they're talking about 10 billion rand. So I think we should appreciate the fact that it has taken Treasury and also government longer to save the airline, but also very important in this respect, the jobs that are now being lost by some of the employees at the airline.
Thank you so much for that. Now, let's get on with the business of the day. Now, Sanusha, the Minister of Cooperative Governance said that not because we're moving to level 1, not because we are out of the woods yet. In fact, I would say that this is probably going to be the toughest time for government as it monitors the nation on level 1.
Absolutely, Unathi. I think that the challenge of moving to level 1 is that it was more of a compelling issue, and the decision was actually one that had to be taken irrespective of what were the structural conditions that currently exist. I mean, listening to the minister and reading the press brief that was released, I mean, she talks about the fact that when level 2 restrictions were announced, our death rate was around about 282 people that have succumbed to the virus, and of course, in terms of new infections, around about just over 2,200. Now, that doesn't mean much, because I think the problem here is we find ourselves in a very unfortunate and in a cul-de-sac, in almost with our backs against the wall, and that's what government finds itself in. Because what's going on is that you've got to get the economy back on track. The challenge we have is we don't have another way in which we can get the economy back on track unless we do what we've been doing previously. And we know the economic model that we've applied from 94. They've been in serious issues and particularly contradictions and holes in that framework. But that's the only model that we know. And at this point in time, we have a labor-intensive economy. If people are not going to go back to work, they're not going to be able to, the livelihood issue has just imploded. Marginalization from the economy has become even more acute and chronic. The entrenched dilemma of households that are basically just not surviving. All of this is a culmination of not just COVID-19, but what has been an ongoing structural set of conditions that have beguiled and afflicted our economy and our socio-economic conditions of society. So I think in this context, it's something that had to be done, but the problem here is we cannot afford a second wave. Whether the second wave comes in because there's movement, whether people have to be more responsible. And I think government is going to try as much as possible through these regulations to ensure that the regulations are adhered to and the restrictions are applied and all of the measures need to be implemented. But unfortunately, that also requires an onus of burden of people to be responsible. And I think one or two of the media and callers that came through in the press briefing asked, how are you going to monitor this? How are you going to apply the regulations? So I think as an ordinary South African, I'm more scared of level 1 lockdown measures than I was of level 3 or level 4.
And in fact, Dr. Koma, it is important that the country goes back to level 1 to revive the economy. But there's an opportunity for government to be responsible here. What are some of your takeouts from South Africa moving into level 1? And what are those opportunities that government can use now to galvanize the nation into a new direction and a way of doing things?
Yeah, to be honest, that the first thing we need to take into account is that there appears to be enforcement fatigue on the part of the police to enforce some of these regulations. It appears we are living in a two-nation kind of setup. You have other people complying with these non-pharmaceutical measures, as we are told, mainly social distancing, hand washing, and wearing of masks in a public space. But also the regulations that prohibit the gathering, for example, the limit in the funeral gathering and also in other gatherings. We have witnessed that since lockdown level 5, 4, and 3, people have not been completely complying with some of these regulations. And as I said, the police, if you go to some of the townships, you realize that people are sort of casual and also complacent. But it is important that the Minister of Culture was able to restate the significance of, one, we are not out of the woods yet. We should not be complacent. We should remain vigilant and also adhere to these precautions or the health protocols. Because as you rightly pointed out, and also as Sanusha said, we have not found a vaccine yet. But the good thing is that, remember, our peak was projected to take place around September. So we have reached our peak much earlier instead of the earlier projection. So what is required is for cabinet not to be risk averse. In that sense, they have to start reopening the entire economy. Because remember, our economy is very small. Before the lockdown or the state of the national disaster in 27 March 2020, our economy was already in a recession. Once we got into the lockdown, projected a revenue loss of 250 billion rand from tobacco and also alcohol tax, because what is referred to as tax. So you had illicit economy thriving amid a pandemic, amid a state of national disaster. So it is important that we get to level 1, but very important, government begins to reopen the entire economic sector, because we cannot afford to have this economic sector such as hospitality, aviation, mining in this instance, where people are losing jobs, and also you have SMEs that have reported that by end of December, we will not be able to stay afloat and also to be able to still operate, given the constraints of, one, accessing funding of the very same 250 billion rand which was put as part of the economic stimulus package. But the take-up rate of the loan is very low because of those impediments that are being put as the conditions to access the fund. So the sooner the economy reopens, the better for the majority of the working class, and also very important for the survival of many of the families that rely on income as part of employment.
All right, thank you for that. We're running out of time, but perhaps as my final question posed to you, and Sanusha, let me just ask this. The rationality as it relates to just some of the regulations that we are now seeing at level 1. I mean, the minister mentioned that funerals are now kept at 100 people, up from the 50, and that weddings are kept at 250 maximum. To what extent is this decision an economic one?
I don't know. I think that the challenge here is, again, the question of community transmission and the fear that if you cap the number in terms of the funeral attendance and the wedding attendance, you may be mitigating some level of risk in terms of transmission. But in terms of the calculation and why that number was arrived at, I have no clue. I mean, this is the problem I'm having in trying to understand this notion of when we peak, when we didn't peak, the numbers, etc. I think we're just sitting here and we kind of, drawing straws in the dark at some point with regard to these numbers and how these numbers are being calculated or how they're being presented. I know we can't basically say all the numbers are bad, but I think the question for me and what I'm really concerned about is maybe there's a delayed peak. I don't know.